Hello dear friends of the digital image. Today I want to present why it can make sense to work with A-mount lenses on the a7RII camera. Don't wonder that you cannot see the logo there. Usually here in this point you can still discover it's the a7RII. It is built together with an E-mount adapter, which existed already in some of the aps-c cameras, which didn't have a 35mm full format sensor. And E-mount basically it's the successor of the original A-mount adapter, which was, for example, existing in the Alpha 57, as you can see here. So here it becomes very obvious. Both cameras have a different housing. The Alpha 57 seems much more fat. So Sony has to invent a trick to prolong the distance from the sensor to the front of the housing, and for this purpose they are offering such an adapter. It's called LA-EA4. There is also a version 3 of it, but in the version 3 there is this little rotor missing, which you can see here on the downside or at the photograph. For example, here in this 50mm lens you see there is this little point where the autofocus is driven by this little rotor, and this rotor originally was already built into the A-mount adapter of the A57, but in the E-mount here it is missing. That's why we have this adapter, and when you build it in front of the housing, then we also start to understand how it was possible that Sony offers this very slim camera from the A7 series, because comparing them now it becomes quite obvious that they have almost the same dimensions again. Now it is possible to use the a7RII together with the old A-mount lenses. Since this is all one company who built the things, the elements are very compatible with each other. The focus has a convincing speed, and interestingly enough, this old 50mm lens can fully provide information to the 35mm full format sensor, so you can save on buying, instead of buying the expensive G-Master lenses. Luckily, during the former years I was collecting some of the A-mount lenses. For example, this tele lens with a zoom factor of 75:300, which is very small and light and transportable. I will also present some test photographs in Lightroom at the end of this video. That means basically for me it was only necessary to buy this housing and this adapter, and now I have access to the whole old set of lenses. Also here the autofocus is functioning well. We get into a zoom area of 300, which is not so bad. A third lens which will be presented in this video. It's the 1855, where you can manually switch on and off the autofocus. But this lens here is just a pure aps-c lens, and that's why the Sony a7RII will crop automatically into the sensor, so that there will be no black frame on the outside of the images. So I don't know if you can really see it now here on the display, but here is a little symbol which explains that the camera is now using the aps-c crop factor automatically, which you can for sure also deactivate. And if you would do this, then some areas on the outside of the image would be blacked out. I don't think that this is very problematic, because the sensor brings 42 million pixels, and in crop mode it is still over 20 million pixels. Since I am working a lot with time lapses also, this is quite positive. When you use raw images, then a small 64 GB SD card can be already used up after 1200 images if you do not crop the photographs while shooting them. Also, this zoom lens supports the full format. You will now see images made with all these three lenses in the following part of the video. So, to make you understand one more what it means that Sony was trying to skip the front part of the camera, I will present you this E-mount lens, which is an original E-mount lens from SAMYANG, 12mm. Everything has to be set manually here, there is no autofocus. But just to explain you, the lens, when it is shown in the advertising, the product photography looks actually like that. The lens seems to be quite short. It is also offered for Canon cameras and Nikon cameras. But the little missing part, or this little black part here in the end, this is the same distance holder which you get from the A-mount adapter of Sony, just to make sure that the same optical laws can be applied also when you have this lens together with the camera. So when you connect this lens to the camera now, then comparing to different cameras, the lens seems longer, and now this whole construction has a little bit the tendency to bend over forward. The only possibility to mount this camera on a tripod is here in the end. But also for this reason, I kind of like to work with this adapter, because this adapter provides a second possibility how to connect your tripod. And then when you connect different lenses in front, then you will be able to balance the camera a little bit more. The last advance which I want to mention, besides the argument of the price, is the fact that if you would only use A-mount lenses with this camera and this adapter together, then through this translucent mirror, just look here on the other side at the A57, it is built in, and the Alpha 7R Mark II has it here in this adapter, and this is closed, and therefore the highly sensitive sensor which is actually free and without any protection. This adapter you can use also to protect the sensor which is very sensitive laying behind, and at the same time the adapter keeps the camera free of dust, which is not so bad either. So now we will see each other back in Lightroom, and we will look at some test images with these three lenses here. So welcome back to Lightroom here. I was already building up these images here in this little archive and changing the coloring of the images. The different lenses have different colors, and up here in the corners you can also see the name of the lenses. So these first four images, unfortunately, I shot them with an ISO 400, but with this Alpha 7R2 camera it's not so much a problem because the sensor offers a high resolution. When we look at this image here in detail, I will make some space, then you cannot really complain about the resolution of this lens. I'll zoom a little bit closer. The edges are excellent. I don't see any chromatic aberrations here, and even with the ISO 400 the image has still a nice quality which is not grainy. So the equivalent to this 50mm lens would be in the DT1855, the 35mm zoom setting, and not 50mm as one could assume. This is just because the DT1855 is a pure aps-c lens, and this leads to the fact that the automatically activated crop factor will naturally cut away some of the edges of the image. Let's have a look at the quality of the image. Also here, when you look precisely, it's a quite convincing result. But here in the edges I see maybe a little bit stronger chromatic aberrations. Let's look down here left in the corner. How sharp are the branches of this tree? I think that we could correct those things by just adding a little bit of more sharpness to the image. I will now zoom out and go back to the 50mm. Also here in the down left corner there is maybe a little higher resolution. Let's compare them directly. To be precise, I would not even say that the 35mm lens is worse than the 50mm. Zooming out one more and using G to get back to the grid view, we will now have a look at the 35 to 70mm zoom lens. And in the 35mm zoom I cannot miss any sharpness here. Here in the edges, as we may have expected, there is minimal chromatic aberrations, but I think this could be corrected quite easily. When you zoom the same lens to 150mm, then we are much closer to the object, to the house, and this still at a resolution of 5304 pixels. We have a slightly milky chromatic aberration, but generally the image gives me the impression that it's still quite clear, and if we would now invest into some developing of the image, we would have a quite convincing result. Now we look at the 300mm zoom. Has most probably been built for consumers because the chromatic aberration is even worse here. When I go to a 1:1 zoom, then it becomes more and more obvious. Let's go back and hit G for the overview. Here is a similar image taken with the same lens but ISO 100. Also here we have an extreme defocus and chromatic aberration, and this is rising even more towards the edges of the image. Let's try to remove chromatic aberrations automatically. I enter the development module and activate this little hook to activate the chromatic aberration. It's still not enough. I will try one more step in the color menu and click here into the violet area. So now the worst is overcome, but still, even if we now go on to manipulate sharpness, we will most probably not be able to completely restore the image. So in maximum tele area of this small 70 to 300 millimeter zoom lens, I think we can forget about it. Let's have a look to this extreme wide angle of the DT1855. The center of the image is supposedly quite sharp here on the sides. We could also say that this is quite an acceptable result. So this old lens is actually quite convincing. Let's go one more into the development module, sharpening, raise luminance, correct the profile. Lightroom was able to discover the data sheet of this lens automatically. Still, the distortion doesn't seem to be removed completely. I will look one more here at the details, and still I would say now there is almost nothing to complain about anymore in reference to what this small lens can do. I go back to the overview by hitting G. I'll compare one more this two 50mm like shots. I will copy the data from this 50mm lens. I will hit Ctrl and Alt U for the correction of the brightness, and I will copy the sharpness and the lens correction options also into this image. Let's have a look one more. The image has now been sharpened. Let's wait for the machine to finish. Yes, that's quite sharp now. D for the development module. Obviously Lightroom also understood that this is a 50mm lens instead. I think the sharpness is even overdone. Let's add a little bit more of luminance and then use Alt and left click to this mask function, so that the sharpness will only be applied to the edges of the image. When we look down one more here, then we can say this is quite a convincing result. Yes, for sure, also this 50mm lens is not a prime lens, also not at an f-stop of 10, but I think it's quite a convincing result. Let's go back to the grid view and copy the same settings from the 50mm lens to the 35mm zoom option of this DT18555. And let's also here in the development module use Ctrl-Alt-U for the automatic brightness adjustment, and with C compare, we will compare those two images with each other now. Left side is the right side is the 50mm lens, and left we have the 35mm zoom, which equals more or less 50mm now on this full format sensor, which is cropped. So they are very different, these lenses, but still they somehow fit themselves with their sharpness in the center. I hope you could develop an own imagination of the quality of those A-mount lenses, and I think it makes somehow sense to use A-mount lenses in the beginning. This is not so bad as one might expect, and then eventually later we can decide to use the prime lenses of the G Master series one day. I hope you are happy with this video. Please like or click or comment, and then eventually we see each other soon again.